All right, so as people continue to sign on, I am just going to go over a couple of housekeeping items. My name's Melody, I'm with CF Leads, and this is a traditional webinar, which means that you can see and hear our panelists, but we can't see or hear you. So if you have any questions during the webinar for our speakers, please use the Q&A box. If you have any general comments or feedback, feel free to use the chat for those. If we have any technical issues, you can always join by phone. The number is here on the screen and it should be in your Zoom invitation as well. And this webinar is being recorded. It will be available on CF Lead's website within the next day or so, if you have to sign off early or if you want to rewatch it. But I think without further ado, I will turn it over to Deborah to introduce the webinar and our speakers for today.
Thank you, Melody. I really appreciate it. I am the president and CEO of CF Leads. And for those of you who don't know, we are your national network of community foundations that are working together to build strong communities. So I want to welcome everyone to this CF Leads webinar on this very important topic and timely topic of how we actually avoid funding hate groups. We all know we're in challenging times. We have documented increases in domestic terrorism. Hate speech is definitely on the rise. And of course, there's concern about how these extremist groups that are supporting this kind of activity are actually being funded. So community foundations, which have huge numbers of donor advised funds, are understandably apprehensive. None of you want to unwittingly support a hate group. Their missions and their actions are contrary to your values. But there is confusion about how to define hate, how to identify what a hate group is, how to monitor your grant making from donor advised funds, and how to engage donors when there is a problem or before there is one. So this issue is, of course, relevant to all community foundations and to all funders, but it is particularly important to community foundations that are taking a visible leadership role in their communities, and as you work to address long-standing inequities in your communities. One problematic grant can destroy the reputational capital that you have painstakingly built up over years and potentially harm relationships and partnerships that are critically important to your building strong communities and that work that is core to your mission. So thankfully, today, our speakers can help. They can help us understand what hate is. They're going to provide some concrete guidance to you for how you can ensure that your foundation is not funding hate. So first, we will hear from David Cass, who's the Vice President of Government Affairs at the Council on Foundations. And he led the project at the Council that resulted in a recent report entitled Values Aligned Philanthropy, Foundations Resisting Hate and Extremism, which discusses the growing problem of hate and extremism, what philanthropy's role might be in addressing it, and offers some recommendations for moving forward. Next, we will hear from Abbas Barzagar, who's the director of the Horizon Forum, which is a nonprofit supporting equity and philanthropy. He's an Islamic scholar who grew up who's been growing really concerned about this issue and has developed really practical tools and trainings to help us address it. We'll hear more about that. And then finally, we're really lucky to hear from Eric Jolly, who is the president and CEO of the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundations, and I'm happy to say a new board member at CF Leads. He has been thoughtfully really leading the way on setting up policies and processes to address hate funding, and has worked really hard on building the internal culture at the foundation to be able to appropriately address this with donors. So the speakers will speak for a total of about 30 minutes, leaving us with plenty of time for questions and answers. And since this is a Zoom webinar, not a Zoom meeting, we're going to ask you to put your questions in the Q&A box and I'll moderate. So I will turn it over to you, David.
Great. Thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you for pulling together this great panel. Abbas and Eric have been real leaders on this issue, so I'm thrilled to be here today. So at the Council on Foundations, we were hearing from members and just across the field that just a lot of folks are trying to figure out how to handle this issue. It is complicated. And so what we did was we interviewed about 25 foundations, PSOs, and advocates, just to hear what people are experiencing and what the challenge is. We also talked to us as part of this. So in the report, we have some recommendations and then 4 case studies of what 4 different foundations have done. And I'm hoping, Melody, you might be able to put the link in the chat for folks to the report. So what we heard, the 2 biggest resources that people need are first just model policies by others. What are people doing who have been leaders on this? And then also just how do you make a decision when it comes to whether a group is a hate group or not? And so one of the things we heard from people is like, could you just kind of give us some boilerplate policy so we can just adopt it? And but I think as we dug into it, it became clear to us at least that that's just not really possible because every foundation is pretty different. People have different values, different focuses. And but the policy does need to reflect the values of the foundation and its missions and goals, its mission and goals. So, some foundations have added a clause to their due diligence policy. Some have written separate policies. Some have added a non-discrimination policy requirement for all their grants. And others are going further and are thinking not just about hate, but harm to communities. How do you end funding not just for hate groups, but other entities that could cause harm? Some people have signed on to the Amalgamated Campaign, which is a whole very interesting body of work. Certainly encourage folks to look into that. So there are a lot of ways, different ways to approach this, and the key is finding what fits for you. So I think the other part that we recommend is that, it's not just about the funds you're giving away, but it's the funds that you're accepting, because publicizing gifts and sponsorships can give credibility to groups that are looking for it. So the other part of this work, we pulled together a resource hub on the council's website that links to a lot of different model policies that foundations can draw from, and hopefully that will be useful to the folks on this webinar. I think the other thing that we heard, though, just in terms of trying to figure out, which list to use. So the Southern Poverty Law Center has a great list of hate groups, but others said that they wanted some additional resources. And so, the complication, obviously, again, is just how do you define a hate group? Especially around very polarizing issues. And that's so for us, what we did is we called this project the Values Aligned Philanthropy, because it's about your foundation's values must be at the core of the work. The other thing is just having a clear procedure attached to your policy. So when questions arise, how do you answer them? What sources of information you'll use, and what is your process? And as Deborah mentioned, when there's a crisis, that's the hardest time to develop the procedure. It's obviously much easier and far in advance to figure out, what will you do and how do you handle it? And then the other question is just how do you communicate your policy and with whom? It's not always easy to bring together stakeholders along, from staff to your donors, to other community stakeholders. But but I think the importance is that clear communication up front with donors is really key. So they know what to expect, and that the sponsoring organization has variance power. So I know you're going to hear a lot more from Abbas and Eric, but that's a brief overview of our report. And look forward to any questions that people have when we get to that section. So thank you.
Thank you, David. I will turn this over to you, Abbas. Now, thanks, David, for that summary of your report, which really has a lot of terrific information. But now I'll turn it over to you, Abbas.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, CF Leads team, for putting this together. Always great to work with you all, and I do appreciate sort of convening at this difficult time of the year. I know it's a crunch time for everybody. I'd like to share a little bit about Horizon Forum's method and approach to this issue, and I'm happy to say that you, Deborah, David, Eric, you all have been absolutely fundamental to developing this model. So I truly feel like it's a collaborative effort here. I'm going to share the screen for just one moment because I think it's important to ground our work in our method. And I'm sharing here a slide, which is basically a flow chart of the way that, let's see here. Does everybody see the slide here? Does everybody see slide, or do they see my desktop? They see the slide?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Slide, yeah.
Okay. This is really emblematic of our theory of change and the way that we work. And so as an applied academic, what I'd like to do is to think that at the top two boxes here, we provide peer learning opportunities for foundations and other stakeholders to really think through complex problems around their work in equity, anti-racism, anti-hate, etc. And one of the ways that we do that is to provide a space for what we call a cross-sector dialogue. And really, this is just a meeting or what we might call a focus group. But we bring together people who really know what they're talking about as far as direct practice is concerned. And they can talk about concrete examples of how their work is operationalized around these larger concepts and kind of harder to grasp issues like equity or anti-racism. What does it actually look like in practice? And then we interface those folks with academics and professional advocacy experts to talk about what a collaborative and shared solution and approach might be. And the direct result of that are typically products that serve the stakeholders in question. And again, this is a sort of stakeholder-centered research model here. And the outcome of that then is a circular process where we then take that information and learning and share it back with the academic and expert communities. And it's that sort of fluid nature of our method that we feel has been successful this year in piloting and operationalizing some of the tools that we've developed. I'll stop sharing now. And what I'd like to do is basically take a moment or two to talk about some of the tools that we have developed. It was a couple of years ago that, if you don't mind me outing you, Eric, if you will, Dr. Jolly, he coached us a couple of years ago and said, look, we need a robust academic list. We need a neutral list that can help practitioners vet hate groups, understand hate groups, and really approach this problem. And so what we've done at Horizon Forum is create such a list that simply augments other existing lists that are out there. The list is composed of a multidisciplinary approach whereby we have academic sources, journalistic sources, advocacy sources, and in that group are leading experts and leading authorities such as SPLC or the Anti-Defamation League. However, we do not limit it just to one or two different kinds of groups. Instead, our approach is to create a database so that you as practitioners know what is out there as far as the conversation is concerned around hate groups. Now, what we've done is that we've created that database, but we haven't just simply left it to that alone. What we've done is we've created a training program, also in consultation with stakeholders here on the panel, as well as in the audience. I see there are a number of friendly faces in the audience too. What we've done is create a training program so that we have a 2-day night or 2 sessions, 90 minutes each, whereby we walk practitioners through the conversation that's already taking place within the peer environment, with the peer learning environment. So what that looks like is, what does a policy look like? What does it look like? What are some options, like David mentioned, in the resources that they've compiled? They show you sample policies. What we do is we walk through some of those sample policies, as well as talk about them in terms of where they exist, how are they related to other areas within your governance structure? Do these things exist within the fund agreement? Are they related to DEI? Are they related to things like an overall ethics policy? But we really concretely ask foundations to think, where is it that the policy exists and how would it then be operationalized? And so again, a peer learning environment to sort of coach groups through that. Then the second piece of the training session moves into the hate screen that we just talked about. What is the hate screen? How might you use it? And what is its approach? And what is it sort of, how is it that you can incorporate it into your existing due diligence programs? I'm going to come back to that point in just a moment because it's an important one to frame properly. But I'll leave you with, before I get to those details, I'll leave you with this note, which is that the hate screen for us is not a compliance list, it's a smoke detector. And so I'll come back to that in just a moment. And then the second day of the training, we come to issues like advanced assessment, gray areas around hate groups. How is it that you understand whether a group is a hate group or not? How do you do a deep dive? How do you do proper research? And what we do is we share with you our research process. We feel that we don't expect community foundations to be able to build up subject matter expertise in this area, but we do think that we can streamline the research process to make it easier if and when you do have a problem, so that you don't have to get an outside consultant, an outside expert to do an assessment for you. There are ways that you can feel grounded in doing some of that research yourself. And then finally, we simply report out some of the great learning we've done, again, by colleagues in this room, about how to engage donors and what does a protocol look like if and when you do have a problem and you have to make a decision. How is it that you engage your donors? How is it that you do community messaging around this, both internally with your own staff as well as externally? And that's what our training package looks like. And I'll tell you that just based on the model, every time that we engage a group, we learn something more and we incorporate it back into the training program. So we've, to date now, we have close to 20 community foundations that have engaged with us on the training and are at different stages of adopting various portions of our tools. Now, before I jump off this right now, I'd like to just return to that smoke detector note. I think that a lot of folks are stuck in between this question on how is it that you define a hate group and how is it that you approach this issue, and if we're going to sort of deny grants, under what authority do you do that? I want to caution that there is no compliance or legal issue here, because the IRS, Supreme Court, and others have left this question to be self-regulated per industry. So you're not alone. Foundations find themselves in the same struggle that social media companies find themselves in, that higher education institutions find themselves in, is that how do you define these boundaries? For us, we think that a risk management point of view is the most important perspective to take when adopting these policies. Like David said, it's a complex subject. Wherever you land on it is up to your institution, but it should be addressed. And at the institutional level, you have a political and reputational risk management issue that you have to address. And so if you think about the hate screen as providing you as much information as possible, you can have a robust and broad framework there. And your protocol on how you decide that can be thin and narrow or as you like thereafter. But the idea of a robust smokescreen is there to protect your institution and help your institution move along. And so just that sort of framework to always keep in mind, risk management versus compliance. I think these are areas to keep in mind as we continue to navigate this conversation. I think I'll stop there. Looking forward to many people's questions. And again, great to see so many friendly faces and familiar faces here.
Thank you so much, Abbas. And thank you for all you have done to really make this concrete for people. It's very scary in the abstract. And I think you've really done a lot of really wonderful work to help us all learn how we can address it. So now we're going to hear from Eric, and Eric, we really looked forward to hearing, what you are doing on the ground and how you have been addressing this issue so thoughtfully at your foundation. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And I want to appreciate Abbas and David's work. It's been just incredible partnership to have these institutions working together. And the documentation of this has been excellent. We're still a work in progress, and I think that will be true for the entirety of dealing with these kinds of issues, because the way in which hate is expressed, the way in which communities are derailed continues to be creatively changed and challenged, and we're going to continue to find a way to look at this. I can share my journey. It will be different than everyone else's, I'm certain, and not necessarily a model. But we began first with establishing clearly our values for DEI, for inclusion, for equity, for standing up for what's right. We adopted a belief that one first step towards justice is the courageous recognition of injustice. And it takes more courage to recognize injustice where it doesn't impact you than when it does. And so we've put together allies to help give credence to some of the concerns others in our community express. And that way we started to position a foundation as a thought leader on these issues of equity and community, and of community building in an equitable way. We modeled it first with our own grant making. And then we started to highlight donors who did other great work in that way. As we began to have the credibility to speak to these issues, not just in leadership, but across our teams, then we knew we could start to tackle the issues of funding hate-based organizations. To do that, we started with, I think what was most important for us, a retrospective analysis. We looked at grant making in the last decade and applied at that time the Southern Poverty Law Center's list and say, what would we have tagged if we had had that chance? What would we have done differently? And once we identified that, we knew a few things. One, we understood the nature and the scope of any issues we were facing. And quite honestly, it wasn't that large. I suspect for most of us, the number of incidents aren't large, but we all know one incident in the right communication mode is going to be a great damage to our reputation and to our belief in our own values and how we exercise them. So by having that handful of cases, we identified the number of donors, how many donors were repeating the same category or issues, and some of the organizations. At that point, we could work with charrettes. We could bring our staffs together and say, all right, what should we have done? How could we have handled it? What communication should have been in place? How would we address this if it happens again? How will we address it? And then looking at all of those things, what policy changes need to be made and what communication needs to be issued. This was a really nice way of getting the staff engaged. You can imagine philanthropic advisors want to know, how will this provide a context to our donors, positive or negative? They all want to have great influence over what we call donor advised funds. And if we're going to still allow it to be donor advised, where do we stop taking their advice? A fair question, and one we practiced in answering. Clearly the monies are not the donors any longer. They've taken their deduction. Almost all of us have the right to say no. But we worked on the charrettes on how we would do that. This was a stepwise approach for our staff. We now had them engaged in this, and we dealt with some of their anxieties and concerns and let them practice ways to speak up. That was our staff. And that meant now we could start looking at our board. Parallel to this, we've been doing work with our board on IDI and other things. We've had them engaged in issues of equity. We've brought together the CEOs of organizations that we fund and have them talk about the kind of things that they aspire to achieve for our community, and where the warning signs are for organizations that impact them negatively. Those would be some of those hate-based organizations you don't want to fund anymore. While bringing our board along, we gave them more information and background, and then introduced this issue of funding hate crime and the risk of it being inadvertent and publicized to our enterprise risk management system. By bringing it in there, our audit and finance committee started to review these kinds of things, and the board got on the same page as the staff. We then had board leadership who would speak to other board members about why we needed to do this. At the same time, we started preparing the same things for our fund holders. Our fund holders were invited to what we call Giving Together workshops, where they get to peel back the curtain and talk to the CEOs on various equity-oriented organizations, and they began to understand that affinity to our work. We worked with podcasts of the workshops, And Senior Vice President and myself sat down with donors and did a couple of Zoom seminars in which we talked about the changing nature of race and the racial stress that we've seen, of course, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, with the murder of George Floyd, Dante Wright, Philandro Castillo, a list that's far too long because there shouldn't be a list at all. We gave them a chance to hear how I, from my Native perspective, looked at these things, how my vice president, from her perspective as a Black leader, looked at these issues, and let them ask questions. Sometimes simple questions like, I don't even know what to say anymore. What we didn't have BIPOC 20, 30, 40 years ago. And they felt comfortable asking those questions, and we felt very comfortable talking with them. We got our fund holders engaged. Once we had our staff ready, our board aligned, and our fund holders engaged, the process wasn't bad. We really haven't run into a tremendous number of problems. First thing that we do is we simply contact the donor and say, are you aware? In every case, our donors have been, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you called me. We don't want to be there. In a case that was retrospective analysis, we did have a donor long since left who wanted to continue that funding. But when we said we would be pulling back the curtain of anonymity on that request, suddenly those kinds of issues weren't as powerful in meaning to the donor. They didn't really want to be seen for that. And then finally, we've had times when we've said to the donor, no, we're not going to do it. What we really like about the work that Abbas is helping us get is we have peers, we have concurrent validity, we have the power of multiple sources, and we've been able to invite any staff, board, or donor to log into several of these websites and see if they think we've made a wrong call. In 8 instances, they tried, and they all came back and said, no, it wasn't a wrong call. There's nothing we can find that says we should be sending money there. I'll stop with that and look forward to any questions about the ways in which we're doing this work. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you, Eric. That's really helpful for people to sort of see exactly what your process has been. And as you say, how you have gotten the staff ready, gotten the board aligned, and gotten fund holders engaged. So you are welcome to put any questions you may have in the Q&A box, any of you participating in this webinar. I'll kick us off with a few questions. David, I know that sometimes we have a basic question, and Abbas kind of alluded to this. Why doesn't the IRS just regulate this? So tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, it would seem like it'd be very simple and straightforward. So, part of it is just, the IRS is set up basically to just look at, do you meet the basic standards of being a nonprofit? And so there's an issue of definition. There's also an issue of just having enough staff capacity. As I think folks know, the amount of staff at the IRS has really decreased over the years. And I think there's also just an issue of, when do you want, what do you want government to be deciding around who gets the qualification and freedom of speech issues? So there are some balances there. But let me, Abbas, I'm sure, can add to that, to what I just said.
Abbas, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was having this conversation with somebody yesterday as well. It's always coming up. I mean, I think it comes back down to this really unusual threshold that the United States has, for better or worse, I believe oftentimes better, around free speech and what constitutes free speech. And just so folks understand, the way that I think about free speech is that we're not talking just about hate speech here, but basically the way that these charities operate is that they'll say that they're eligible for charitable work because they're doing public education and educational type of work. And so that then normally falls under sort of speech or activity. And in the United States, speech isn't illegal until it's illegal for other reasons. Like it's illegal because you're harassing somebody or intimidating somebody. Like those activities are already illegal. And so when speech does that, then it becomes illegal. So there's really not much to regulate speech as such. And then it becomes harder and harder for the Supreme Court to define, what that harm might be. That is a really high threshold that we deal with in the United States. And so it's up to us how we want to manage and regulate that ourselves. And I think it presents a great challenge, but also a great opportunity for foundations, especially community foundations. And thank you for opening my eye to this, Deborah, for leading the way towards civic engagement and civic sort of opportunities in the United States to depolarize. Set the example. You're at the hierarchy of what civil society looks like in your local context. And so what does it look like if you take that leadership role on?
Thank you. Is there, either one of you, is there any possibility that there will be tighter regulation on this, or does it look like it's going to stay this way?
I mean, I think it's just, first is just getting Congress to agree on something is very, very challenging, particularly on, this is such a polarizing issue. So I don't know that that's going to happen anytime soon.
Great. So Eric, how much involvement has this work taken from you as the CEO?
The right amount. And what I mean by that is it is not our habit to outsource that part of our leadership. And I really want to be certain that our staff hears their CEO speak to these things with the expectation that they will as well. And that's going to be important for us. It is not an onerous, overbearing amount of time. I sat in on the charrettes because I wanted to. I was engaged in some aspects of it, but I made certain that I didn't do it all. And so it wasn't a lot. It wasn't a lot to carry. You want other staff engaged in carrying this. And I think that's that's essential, but you can't be absent. You can't outsource this.
And how many have kind of come to the surface, Eric, that have been kind of red flags for you? And then what has been your role if you've had to talk to donors?
I've only had to talk with one donor. What we usually do is have our philanthropic advisor, the person's closest to them, but we ask, are you comfortable doing it? If not, we'll coach, and we'll coach up the line until we get someone who says, yes, I'm comfortable. The reason you don't want to have the CEO start this is you've got nowhere to go but the board after that. So I want my staff to do it. And then if the donor says, well, I still have a question, to go to their supervisor. And if the donor says, well, I still have a question, to come to me. And by that time, they'll see we are firm, we are united, we are consistent. And we very simply say it's done. So that's how we've managed that. We did have a donor who was one of those where you said it's on the edge, and but we didn't see anything that passed any of the places that Abbas had flagged, but we didn't like the way the donor represented their values. And when we talked to the donor, we finally said, we need to fire you. You need to see if there is another organization that you want to work with, because we're not going to manage you anymore. We don't want you associated with us. It's not the causes you're funding.
And that's one of the questions we have here is, did you have to fire a fund holder? It sounds like you did. How did that work? How did that conversation go? Very specifically.
In this specific instance, that fund holder had a fund which was managed by siblings, and they had been working together for a very long time. And we called the siblings, and they agreed that this was a problem they couldn't contain themselves and that they needed to find a different place to go. And we let them work as an intermediary with the most problematic individual. In other cases, it's very simply a matter of sitting down and saying, if this is your value, you're in the wrong place. For example, the Women's Foundation of Minnesota has long ago established their sense of boundaries. And when the Boy Scouts of America were pinged with anti-LGBTQ sentiments, very simply, they stopped allowing their donors to go there. None of their donors were surprised by this, because that's how they represent themselves. I can't represent that wonderful foundation. It's got fantastic leadership, but that fantastic leadership also showed the integrity of the beliefs that they greeted the donors with from the very beginning. And you find that donors are not surprised if you've been standing up and being noted.
Right.
I have not had any donor who said, where did that come from? Some
Right.
of them have said, yeah, you're one of those. And I said it proudly so.
Right.
And,
But they weren't surprised.
And they weren't surprised.
Yeah. Yeah. So Abbas, we got a couple questions here related to, do we have a list of the groups? Can we combine these lists so we don't have to reinvent the wheel? So do you want to tell us a little bit, give some specifics about what you've put together so painstakingly?
Yeah, absolutely. And cheers to my colleague Zainab Bahrain, who's not on the call today, for leading the way on that. Well, we do have a list, but it is an aggregated list. And so I want to really make that clear that it is not Horizon Forum making the determination on what a hate list, what a hate group is or isn't. Instead, what we've done is simply take multiple sources, SPLC, ADL, an encyclopedic resource, another academic, university-based institution, and then advocacy organizations like GLAAD or the Council on American Islamic Relations. These groups either contain lists or they monitor groups that they feel are causing harm to their communities, and this is distinctly groups that they believe are a danger, threat, or harmful to their communities. This is not simply a list like Political Research Associates, which monitors, for example, the far right, or the opposite, right, where there's just groups that are monitoring other sides of the political spectrum. These are really fringe groups, and they will include organizations that are on all sides of the political spectrum, or what I would like to say, off the political spectrum, because they're not really considered respectable institutions. So what we've done is simply create an Excel sheet. Has a list of organizations, the EINs, and which of these sources lists them as a group, and then a small little paragraph that says why they're considered as such. We tested that list this year, and it's sort of being tested out by other foundations right now, and we're revamping it and updating it as we speak. Hopefully in the spring, that will also include new academic sources, as well as we are mining Facebook's dangerous actors and individuals, dangerous organizations and individuals list. This has been a sort of priority for the public to get their hands on for years and years now, and it got leaked during September and October, when there was Facebook was really in the headlines, or Meta, I should say, is in the headlines quite a bit. And so we're mining that for any 501c3 and C4 organizations. I'll say finally that the screen that we deliver to foundations for use is exclusively around C3s and C4s. It has about 150 organizations on it, and that is culled from a broader aggregated list, which is approaching 700 sources or so now. And then we expect both of those lists to increase by the first quarter next year. Yeah, that's the sort of idea on what the tools actually look like.
And have you found, Abbas, that community foundations have an easier time of sort of communicating what they're doing if they've got this, combination of lists as opposed to just one?
I believe so. Obviously, there's some bias here for me saying that, but that is reporting out. I think the more tools, the better for community foundations. The thing, more that they're relying upon, the better. The more information you can inform your donor with, the better. And so I have heard that community foundations feel strengthened by a tool like this at their leadership level. And
Abbas, do you want to talk a little bit more about how people can access the tool? We can announce that there will be a training, just for community foundations, and we'll refer to that just in a little bit later. But that Abbas will be holding. But maybe you can tell people how they might get access to this and how they work to get that from you.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll talk a little bit more about the training and some dates that we have. And thank you, CF Leads, for partnering with us on that. But basically, it's a pretty straightforward process. You just contact us. We normally have a phone call to just touch base, see where the organization's at with what they need. Some folks aren't ready for the full training, but they want the list in order to do, for example, transaction history, like Eric mentioned. What does the last decade look like? What does the last 5 years look like? And we're happy to do that too. We just want to be able to give a 15 to 20 minute presentation about what the list is, how it came together, how to use it. And so you just really contact us, and we can start setting up appointments to that. We also do the group cohort training, which we'll talk about again in just a moment.
And we'll be sure that people have access to your contact information. So we have another question here that I'm going to send to you, David, first here. Do we know how the commercial DAF sponsors like Fidelity are addressing this issue?
So, I think that they are certainly trying to, they're putting a lot of resources into this. We had some conversations with several of them about in the report. But I think, like for all of us, I think it's tricky. How do you define it? How do you have clarity? How do you have consistency? How do you educate donors? But I think they are certainly trying to make an effort. But I think, some of the issues are different, I think, than what community foundations face. Community foundations obviously being in a community with specific values as opposed to being a national, commercial fund with so many different kinds of stuff. So I think they've got their hands full in trying to figure it out.
Great. Abbas, do you have any additional information? Yeah.
Yeah, actually, yesterday when I was on the phone with a large national DAF provider, and what we're finding is that on the sort of public facing side, it seems like national DAF providers are aloof to the question or just handing it off to the IRS or something like that. But that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems that the major actors do have internal processes, procedures, and at the very least, some exploratory committees. And they're simply not sharing those for proprietary reasons and for their business models. But I do think that they are pursuing the question. They do have these kind of due diligence processes in place. We just might not have as much visibility into those as we would think. I'll give one example. There is one step from one national DAF provider that said that they actively look to see if there are any ongoing investigations, actual legal investigations or claims made against a particular group, and that because that approaches a legal threshold, they feel like they can then take that step forward, and they're doing that on a kind of temporary or pause basis. And so that was sort of one step that I heard from one DAF provider, and that's a different approach than what we've heard. But again, one more tool in the process that people could consider adding.
Do either of you know, has this been of any threat to their reputational capital? I mean, it's so critically important to community foundations because we're out there partnering and actively advancing racial equity. And this is a core part of our values. What has been the impact on the for-profit financial services sector? Any?
I mean, I think they are concerned. There is a for-profit business. They are concerned about reputation. And so I think they are putting resources into it. But I think they don't want to, as Abbas said, they don't want to publicize what those are. I think there's also probably some. They're keeping their secret sauce secret. But I was actually impressed as we talked to a couple how many people they have on this in each of the commercial funds. And then I think another big area is just for corporate giving programs. You have an employee who makes a contribution, and the big corporations, obviously, they're very sensitive to their reputation. And so it's not in their name, but it's an employee's name. And so how much effort the big corporations are putting into this as well to try to make sure that they aren't giving to hate groups. So it's, they're sort of different issues, but there are a lot of people who are, I think, trying to be very thoughtful on how to deal with this across the corporate, commercial, and then obviously community foundation sectors.
Right.
Actually, if I could sorry, Deborah, could I just jump in with
in.
one more thing here? I did want to share that outside of DAF providers and DAF sponsorship, an adjacent sector to you is just financial services. And so I'm really excited to say that we're partnering with a proper financial institution, an international bank, who's interested in the list just for transaction monitoring history. They don't really care much about the anti-hate policy. They don't do DAPs or charitable work or anything like that, but they just they need to know. And so that risk mitigation approach, again, has been deeply informed by interacting with these different types of institutions, that the more information, the better.
You know, Abbas, it might be helpful for you to give us a story of where this has gone wrong for a community foundation. If you don't want to name names, obviously don't. But just very briefly, what has this felt like on the ground when it's gone wrong, when there's been a grant to a hate group?
Yeah, I'm happy to, and again, just amplify the leadership of some of our community foundation colleagues out here. There was one instance where a fund agreement was established with a donor, and that fund agreement was sort of redlined by the donor to include an extra clause that just sort of made an emphatic point about the donor being able to contribute to any IRS compliant institution. And so then a new CEO, so that fund agreement was amended as such and accepted by a particular CEO. Now, that CEO stepped away, the board transitioned, a new CEO came in, but that fund agreement was grandfathered in. That fund agreement effectively locked the new institution or the institution in place, and the donor began slowly to increase its contributions to a particular really nasty hate group. It's not some, sort of, online blog or anything like that, but a proper mainline hate group, one of the ones that you see on a regular basis in news media, et cetera. And the general counsel, the board, and the executive leadership were stuck because they were frankly afraid to take the step and really enforce variance power at that point. And so they continued, because of drag and lag, they continued to allow this fund to, donate to this hate group. And then finally it hit national media. And so then it hit national media, then the local media got a hold of it. And it was month after month after month of bad press for the course of properly a year, where the reputational capital was really hurt. And not just the reputational capital, but then the anxiety across the staff, the kind of time commitment it required of the CEO, et cetera, and the level of distraction that it took there. And what was most shameful about, I should say, regrettable about the whole thing, was that the institution was actually really progressive on DEI and equity issues everywhere else. But because it hadn't implemented this anti-hate policy and really worked it into its governance structure, it was caught flat-footed. Yeah, I should say now that foundation is really a pioneer in this work and a great partner with us, and that they implemented the anti-hate policy. They closed the fund down, asked the donor to take their money elsewhere, stewarded the money elsewhere. And we feel like that was a great conflict transformation opportunity, but it really is an exemplary case story about how things can go wrong. I don't know if the level of risk is that level of risk is consistent across the space.
Yeah,
but it is out there.
Yeah. Eric, you have said, I think you said in every case, the donor was happy to hear about this, to hear from you. They didn't know. I don't think we realized that. So tell us more about that.
So let me dial it back. In every case since we've put this in place.
Okay.
As we were putting it in place, there were times when we had disagreements with donors, and I spoke to the one who we had a less than amicable divorce, and one from which we had simply a stop of funding, of accepting their responsibility. But since we've put this in place, the ability to talk to people about what's out there and what their group is, where their group is clustered, is really important. And most often donors don't see this. So I would invite people to look at Abbas's list, the ACLU, the Anti-Defamation League list, and get to know some of the organizations that are in your region or state. You will be, I hope you won't be, because you're already doing this, but you might be surprised. There are Nazi youth training camps in Minnesota. which name themselves wonderfully, like with the same creativity that our legislators name bills, right? The traditional youth camp. It's not the tradition that we mean to support. So sometimes you just have to peel that away for the donor, or to say, look, let me give you 3 examples where we're not going, and you're one of them, and list 2 others so that they can see where they're being clustered. So we've been very successful at the conversation level because we escalate slowly. And why have they said thank you? Do I believe they all meant thank you? Do some of them mean, oh crap, I got caught? Maybe, but they don't say it that way. We've gotten thanks in every case where we started with a slow conversation and escalated it by example and by association. The power of Abbas's list is we're also protected by that association. When I talk about concurrent validity, I mean, we can show 3 different sources that said this is wrong. We can now talk about 20 other community foundations who said they share this standard, and to really show the donor when they are out of step with a larger community, rather than just thinking, there goes that Eric Jolly and his team of, well, left wing, right wing, I get called both. You know, we don't go there. We really talk about it being a community standard, not an individual standard.
And Deborah, if I could add, I mean, so as we interviewed people, just to underscore what Eric said, that's what we heard as well, is that, you know, most of the time, the donor either wasn't aware and was glad to be told, or that, you know, I think just being outed a little bit kind of backed down. So I think, you know, one of the fears, obviously, any community foundation is if you go to the donor, are they going to be mad? And that's certainly not what we've heard. But I think the second part of that is just to underscore what we were talking about earlier, is that the importance of a list, but the importance even more so of having a policy in advance. So that donor knows, so all your donors know, here are our values, and here's where we will go and won't go. And so that there's no doubt in that donor's mind when they're confronted about a specific grant, that this is our policy, we've had it, it's crystal clear, you know, when you signed, you know, we told you about it. And so I think that's the other part of it, because, you know, nobody wants to be on the front page of the newspaper, you know, because at that point, it's just really, it is, you're managing crisis as opposed to being able to contain it in the early stages.
Right.
And I would add to that, if I could, it's not a policy that says X list at this date. It's about the values, and that we understand that how those are manifest will change, because there will be a creative workaround somewhere.
Well, and Eric, you might address this other question. One of our most conservative donors considers the Southern Poverty Law Center itself to be a hate group. As I recall, you had a board member or donor who was similar. Have you heard of this? Where has this come from? How did you react?
So unfortunately, the founder, Morris Dees, resigned in circumstances that had people questioning the integrity of the entire organization. We know that they have a segment which is about advocacy, and there are people who disagree with the positions they take and have a political right and reason for doing that. The segment that deals with the list is a completely firewall division that puts together a list based on very select, narrow, and rigorous criteria. We shared those criteria with our complainant and said, which of these do you disagree with? And we let them investigate a couple of the organizations online. We encouraged them to. But we also have the values of being able to say, it's not just here, it's on ADL, it's on Horizon Forum. And that's the power of it not being just one group. It's very often, if somebody lists 5 ideas and one of them, 5 propositions, and one of them is false, we will dismiss all the other 4. It's human nature. You find one reason, one exception, you say no. We work very hard to talk about that firewall and the lack of ambiguity with SPLC, and we don't defend the part of SPLC that is more political and more advocacy.
Okay.
That's how we deal with it, but we take them out of, don't allow them to look at the part they dislike and ignore the part that doesn't fit their reality.
Okay. Okay. Abbas, anything to add there?
No,
About
no.
SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center. Yeah.
Well, there was a question in the chat about SPLC's list and how it's considered a hate group itself, et cetera. So for those of you that might have conservative donors that are really on the kind of further right of the spectrum, SPLC is a fire rod organization in many of these circles, and sort of I'd say like some, second or third tier kind of online media groups. It's just become emblematic of a certain kind of political discourse that, I think that they're just being maligned in certain ways that's not right. And, I don't think it's fair to the great work that they've done otherwise. And so it's just a lightning rod institution. So people should be wary and be able to place that sort of for a donor in kind of a broader political spectrum, like Eric is saying. Like, how do you make that donor education broad, wide, and not sort of in a confrontation or a narrow confrontation?
Okay.
Deborah, if I could just add.
Sure.
I mean, look, I think SPLC has done great work, but if for whatever reason you don't like their list, that's okay, right?
Right.
You don't have to use that list. The key thing is just defining your own values and then judging against those values. I think that's really the thing that's most important.
Or use multiple lists, kind of thing. Yeah. So last question here. Is there any organization, or do any of these lists, yours, Abbas, work in Canada? There's an organization, someone here from Canada, wondering if there's anyone compiling this type of list there.
I saw that, and I'm not aware. I would love to learn more about that. That's a possible point of collaboration.
Eric?
After 9/11, I was with a team at Education Development Center, created a curriculum called Beyond Blame, Reacting to the Terrorist Attack. It's a follow-up to that, and continuing work in that for more than 15 years. The Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center at Calgary has developed a parallel curriculum. They also do research on other forms of hate and hate mitigation. I don't know if they have such a list, but I would start with the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center. And if they don't, find someone who might want to work with Abbas to help hone a parallel product for us out of Canada.
Yeah, good. Okay, thank you for that additional information, Eric. So thank you all. Really appreciate all your expertise that you've shared with us today, David, Eric, and Abbas. And now we just want to, so Melody looks like she put a potential Canadian resource up. Thanks so much, Melody. And then we just wanted to alert you all of this. I think Melody has a slide on this of the training coming up with Abbas, offered in partnership with the Horizon Forum. It is Tuesday, February 22nd and Tuesday, March 1st for 90 minutes at a time. So Abbas, do you want to talk about this just a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I know we're right against the clock here. So again, these are just 2 90-minute sessions walking through policy, the hate screen, sort of advanced assessment. How do you actually know? How do you do that research? And then donor engagement. And it's really a peer learning environment. What we do is that if you sign up for this group session, we still will engage with your organization for an hour ahead of time, schedule a call just to get an understanding of where you're at in this process, if at all. Some groups are sort of way beyond what we can offer, but still join just for the information. And then you join the group cohort. You get the database as part of this, and then you get added to a listserv of alumni from the program. And then we're available for just kind of roughly 5-7 hours, whatever you might need from us throughout the year. If you want us to review any documentation that you have, if you want to call us and chat about a group, if you want to get our opinion on something, if you want us to come back in and train the rest of your staff, we're more than welcome to do that. But basically, we basically provide this service so that we can stay engaged, learn from you, and then really help advance the sector move along with these tools.
Great, thank you. And feel free to call us too if you have questions. And then David, thank you so much for putting in the chat those some sample policies from your report. I really appreciate that. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate the work of our presenters here, and we are adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Deborah. Thanks again, Deborah.
Great work. Great work. Thanks so much.
Appreciate you. Bye now.